Can you imagine a world where you could just travel across Europe with no passport, where money and goods just flowed freely across almost every border? Well, that was the world before 1914. But in the summer of that year, everything, and I mean everything, changed. World War I didn't just redraw the maps. It kicked off a 100-year-long war of ideas, a battle over the biggest question in economics. Who should be in charge, the state or the market? That one question would shape the entire century to come.
And this right here, this is what some historians call the Great Rupture. Just look at the difference. On the left, you've got Europe in 1913. It's prosperous, it's connected. And on the right, just 5 years later, you're looking at the hunger map of 1918, a continent just devastated by famine. This isn't just about a war, it's about the end of a whole economic world and the pretty violent birth of a brand new one. You know, this brilliant satirical map from 1914 really captures the mood. This wasn't some peaceful world that just accidentally tripped into a war. No way. It was a powder keg. You can see Russia as this giant lumbering bear. Germany is all military might. Britain's a bulldog. Everyone was armed and ready to go. And when that keg finally exploded, it forced governments to step into the economy in a way they had never, ever imagined.
Right, so that explosion meant governments had to completely reinvent themselves. The sheer scale of what they started calling total war meant that the old laissez-faire idea, that government should just leave the economy alone, was suddenly completely off the table. It just wasn't an option anymore. Survival meant taking control.
And to understand why, you have to look at the human cost. I mean, these numbers are just staggering. Over 2.7 million dead in Germany, 2.3 million in Russia, almost 2 million in France. To keep a war going on that scale, you can't just rely on the free market. You have to mobilize every single person, every factory, every scrap of food. And let's be honest, only the state has the power to do that.
So, what did this actually look like on the ground? Well, governments essentially took over. They started coordinating whole industries, telling car factories to make tanks instead of cars. They rationed food to make sure both soldiers and civilians could eat, and they threw up massive protectionist tariffs to control trade, like the UK's 33% tariff in 1915. All of a sudden, the state was the commander-in-chief of the economy.
And you can see the result right here in the data. In just 4 years, public spending as a slice of the entire economy more than tripled in the UK. And it went up 5 times over in France and Germany. This wasn't just a little adjustment. This was an economic earthquake. And it set a huge precedent. When a crisis hits, the state can, and absolutely will, take charge.
After the war, there was this attempt to go back to the good old days. But you can't just put the genie back in the bottle. The system was broken. The absolute chaos of the 1920s and 30s, ending with the Great Depression, brought the whole world to a crossroads. The market had failed, creating this huge vacuum, and radical new ideas came rushing in to fill it.
And the breaking point was the Wall Street crash of 1929. I mean, just look at this graph of the Dow Jones. It literally falls off a cliff. But this crash did so much more than just wipe out people's savings. It completely destroyed people's faith in that old hands-off, laissez-faire capitalism. Everyone was desperate for an alternative.
And out of that chaos, 2 totally different paths emerged. Over in the West, you get the rise of the interventionist state. This was guided by guys like the economist John Maynard Keynes, who said, hey, governments need to spend money to manage the economy, especially in a crisis. On the complete opposite side, you had the Soviet model, communism, where the state just took total control of everything through central planning.
Now, this economic despair had some pretty terrifying political side effects. As you can see on this map, the 1930s saw this explosion of authoritarian, fascist, and communist regimes all across Europe. When the market economy fails, it fuels political extremism, and it was pushing the world closer and closer to another, even worse global war.
So after World War II, the stage was set for the ultimate showdown. The Cold War wasn't just about spies and missiles between the US and the USSR. It was a global competition between 2 completely opposed economic systems. The big question was, which one could actually deliver a better life for its people?
You can literally see the battle lines being drawn in the propaganda of the time. On the left, you've got this positive vision of the Marshall Plan, a ship helping rebuild Europe. But on the right, a French communist poster shows America as this capitalist octopus with its tentacles all over their country. This was a war for economic influence, fought for the hearts and minds of millions.
And the Western model, well, it had a secret weapon in this fight: prosperity.
This graph from France is just incredible. It shows the wealth of the richest 10% actually falling, while the wealth of the middle 40%, the middle class, is steadily climbing. Creating this broad consumer middle class through things like welfare programs became the West's greatest social achievement and really its best defense against communism.
So what exactly was the other side offering? Well, the Soviet model was what's called a centrally planned economy. But what does that really mean? Okay, imagine the entire economy of a country being run not by supply and demand, but by a government committee that makes every single decision, from how many tractors to build to the price of a loaf of bread. The market had zero say.
This cartoon series just nails the long-term result. In the 40s and 50s, the Russian bear looks pretty strong, balancing on its planned economy. But as the decades go by, you start to see the cracks, the inefficiency, the lack of new ideas, the massive coordination problems. By the 1980s, the bear's wobbling all over the place, and by the 90s, the whole thing just comes crashing down.
So with the fall of the Soviet Union, it really looked like the debate was over. The market had won, period. This kicked off this huge era of globalization. But just as one major competitor left the stage, a new economic giant was rising, and it was getting ready to play the game by a whole new set of rules.
Actually, this shift started even before the USSR fell. Back in the 1980s, leaders in the West, like Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, were leading this powerful counter-revolution. They were pushing hard for a return to the market, with policies like slashing taxes, cutting regulations, and basically getting the state to take a big step back from the economy.
At the very same time, a completely different kind of revolution was happening in China. And this famous quote from its leader, Deng Xiaoping, just says it all. He's basically saying, forget the communist ideology. If market ideas can make our country rich, then that's what we're going to use. It was pure pragmatism.
And the results? They were just mind-blowing. Look at China's GDP per person on this graph, starting from 1978. It's not a curve, it's a rocket ship taking off. By mixing the raw power of the market with the absolute authority of the state, China pulled off the most dramatic, most rapid economic transformation in all of human history.
So, with the market's victory and China's incredible rise, it seemed like the stage was set for the 21st century. But then, a series of massive crises hit that just shattered that consensus. It turned out the old debate between the state and the market, it was far from over. In fact, it was back with a vengeance.
The first big shock to the system was the 2008 global financial crisis. As you can see here, it was fueled by this huge explosion of risky or subprime lending in the U.S. housing market. And this was a direct result of decades of financial deregulation. The fact that the entire global financial system almost collapsed was a pretty brutal reminder of what can happen when the market is left completely unchecked. The second huge challenge is rising inequality. This chart shows how much of the total income goes to the richest 1%. After falling for most of the 20th century, you can see it's just shot up since the 1980s, especially in places like the US and the UK. And this trend is forcing a new, really urgent conversation about fairness and whether the current system is actually working for everybody.
So that brings us to today. With massive challenges like climate change and pandemics, we're still asking those same fundamental questions. But the choice isn't so simple anymore. It's not just state versus market. The new battle is about how to blend them together. So the real question for our time, the one that will define this century, is this: who gets to write the rules for that new blend, and who will it truly benefit?